Hello, class. My name is Madison,
Hey guys, I'm Burke.
and we will be giving you a presentation on attitude formation. So to start off our presentation, we're going to give an activity called the Dove Counterbalance Intelligence Test. This was an intelligence test created by Adrian Dove, and he called it the Black American IQ Test for Honkies. Most of the intelligence tests that we have in the US are culturally biased, and a lot of minorities are not able to do well on them because it isn't culturally appropriate for them. So Adrian Dove designed his own exam for the African Americans in the 50s and 60s to show the difference in their culture based on or compared to our culture. So we're going to ask you a number of questions, and they are multiple choice. And for this activity specifically, it doesn't matter what the answer is. We're using this activity to show you what it would be like to be asked questions that are not culturally appropriate to you. So the first question is, what are the Dixie hummingbirds? So A, part of the KKK, B, a swamp disease, C, a modern gospel group, D, a Mississippi Negro, paramilitary strike force, or E, deacons. And we're going to give you about 5 seconds to complete each of these.
The opposite of a square is A, round, B, up, C, down, D, hip, or E, lame.
Tell it like it. A, thinks I am. B, baby. C, try. D, is. Or E, y'all.
You got to get up early in the morning if you want to A, catch the worms, B, be healthy, wealthy, and wise, C, try to fool me, D, farewell, or E, be the first one on the street.
A handkerchief head is A, a cool cat, B, a porter, C, an Uncle Tom, D, a hottie, or E, a preacher.
Many people say that Juneteenth, June 19th, should be a main legal holiday because this was the day when A, slaves were freed in the US, B, the slaves were freed in Texas, C, the slaves were freed in Jamaica, D, the slaves were freed in California, or E, Booker T. Washington died.
Do the Beatles have soul? A, yes, B, no, or C, gee whiz, or maybe.
A hype is a person who A, always says he feels sickly, B, has water on the brain, C, used heroin, D, is always ripping and running, or E, is always sick.
So this activity was just one example of a culturally biased test. And this one specifically was in favor of the African American culture. So as you can see, it would be hard if you didn't understand some of the dialect that they use. It would be really hard for you to get some of those correct.
Yeah, I mean, this test just goes to show how a culturally biased test could affect a person. We don't expect anybody here to know the answers to any of these questions. I mean, these questions were, if you're African American living in the 60s, then you might understand the dialect and understand the questions. But this is how African Americans might feel if they're taking you know, a test designed by white culture that may be foreign to them. So Jane Elliott was a third grade teacher from Riceville, Iowa. And in 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, she had one of her students come up to her and say, they killed the king. Um, you know, at that time, Riceville, Iowa is a predominantly white town. And there wasn't many other teachers that focused on teaching the importance of discrimination to their children because it just wasn't a priority for them. So Jane Elliott felt she had to conduct an exercise that could better teach discrimination to her children rather than just talking about it. So she decided the best way to do this would be to have a classroom activity where the students could experience discrimination for themselves. And she called this classroom activity the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise. For this exercise, Elliott separated the children of her classroom into two groups. One group was the blue-eyed group, and the other group was the brown-eyed group. This exercise was a total of 3 days. It wasn't like a proper experiment. It's more of a correlational exercise to see if there's a correlation between groups that are blue-eyed and brown-eyed. So for the first day of the exercise, the blue-eyed group was the superior group, and they had advantages such as they would, you know, they go out to lunch first. They could eat seconds. They get extra 5 minutes of recess, or they could drink from the water fountain, where the brown-eyed group wasn't able to drink from the water fountain. They had to drink out of paper cups. So Elliott made the brown-eyed students wear a collar around their necks so they could be identified from a further distance. Now, this class, usually the students before this exercise got along, but after this exercise, there was some tension, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So on the first day, the blue-eye group was the superior group, had all the benefits, and the brown-eye group was labeled as the inferior group. They weren't as smart. Basically, anything that the brown-eyed students did that was a mistake, she would, you know, ostracize the children and make them feel as if their mistakes were attributed to their brown eyes. On the second day of the experiment, the rules were inverted. Elliott told her students that what she told them the day before was a lie, and that actually brown-eyed students were superior to blue-eyed students. So all the rules got inverted. Now the brown-eyed kids had all the advantages, and the blue-eyed group, they had to wear the collar around their neck. And after recess, on the second day, there was a fight that broke out between two of the boys. And, you know, these kids were friends. They never had a problem, but because now, just based off solely the color of their eye, they were getting into fights because one of them called the other one brown eyes, and the other one got offended, so he retaliated. And where there wouldn't normally be an issue, now there's an issue among peers based solely off the color of their eyes. Now, on the third day, there were no more groups. And Elliott just had a classroom discussion with her students about how they felt being discriminated against and how it felt being in a superior group versus the inferior group. And, you know, all the students, they replied that it wasn't good. They felt like dogs. They felt like, they weren't worthy. And the effect that this had on the children was that, can you take time out? So on the third and final day, Elliot had a discussion with her whole classroom. Um, she made the students wearing collars throw them out, and she asked them how they felt being discriminated against. And the children, they felt horrible. It lowered their self-esteem. They weren't performing as well, uh, and it just changed their attitudes overall towards each other and towards how they performed their schoolwork. So to measure the correlation of the inferior and superior groups, Elliott conducted um, a phonics exercise, which is known as the the Orton Gillingham phonics. And what this exercise is basically, it involves very direct and explicit ways to teach literacy when reading, writing, and spelling. So Elliot would do this by using a deck of cards, not playing cards, but special phonics cards, and she would time the students. On the first day, when the blue eye group was superior, they finished the exercise in 2.5 minutes. Um, while the brown eye group, when they were in the inferior group on Monday, they finished the exercise in 5 minutes. The next day, when the roles were switched, the blue eye students actually took longer. It took them almost 4 minutes to complete the exercise, while the brown eye students improved their time down to 3 minutes. When Elliot asked their students, why do you guys think you didn't perform as well the day before? The brown eye students replied by saying that because they were wearing the collar around their neck, it changed their attitude. They were preoccupied with, how they were being perceived by others, how they viewed themselves. So they weren't able to concentrate as much on the exercise at hand. So it really does show a strong correlation between the labeling of inferior and superior groups versus the brown-eyed and blue-eyed groups. Madison, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Thank you. I'll just go on with the additional research. So, additional research on attitude formation. Jane Elliott has done this exercise on a number of different groups, but after doing it on her third grade class, she decided to do it on adults at Green Haven Correctional Facility by holding a day-long workshop. So for this exercise, it was interesting because the majority of the people at this facility were African American or Hispanic American. So she used the same style by breaking up the groups between the brown eye and the blue eye groups. And this time she started by having the brown eye start as superior. So for this day-long workshop, it started at 9 a.m. and she pulled in the brown-eyed group and she kind of laid out some ground rules, kind of told them what was going to happen and kind of just told them how this exercise would affect them and how it would affect the other group. So meanwhile, the blue-eyed group were outside of the meeting room waiting for her to allow them to come in. And while they were waiting, she had them put collars around their neck so that they could be signified as who they were without looking them in the eyes. You could tell who they were just by a collar around their neck. And before she let them come in the room, she told the brown-eyed adults that not to trust the blue-eyed adults. The blue-eyed adults can't be trusted. Don't let them sit next to you. Don't let them sit next to you because they smell different and they look different. And she already was creating this hate between the two different groups before the brown-eyed group had even met the blue-eyed group. So about 9:30, she let the blue-eyed group come in. So about 30 minutes late for the workshop, she immediately started hounding them for showing up late. She was calling them disrespectful and said that they have no respect towards time and that they just are so disrespectful towards the group and to others. So she was already hounding them before the exercise even started. So rather than flipping roles like she did with the students on one day and then the other, for this, she used a test to have them prompt responses. So this way she could kind of control them by having them take this test. She would ask them a series of questions, and then she would collect the tests and then ask them to grade each other on how they did. And as they were going through and grading them after the test was over, she called out a couple of the blue-eyed people and just kind of used that as a way to make them inferior. She said that they sorry. Anyway, I had to collect my thoughts real quick. But after some pushback from each other, they began to push back towards each other after she created this test. And although she didn't have them leave and come back and kind of, they didn't have the same qualities that she did with the third grade class. Instead, it led to a discussion between them, and it was cool because with adults she was able to have a little higher order discussion, just that led to a greater understanding towards each other. So it was a little more productive with adults, and I think it was really great that she started with having the brown-eyed adults be superior, because by doing this it let the blue-eyed adults see how the brown-eyed people felt, like how African Americans, how minorities, how Hispanic Americans feel in that same position that the blue-eyed adults were put in. So after that, after her initial research, an associate professor named Stephen Armstrong did a follow-up study by going back to Riceville, Iowa, and following up on the exercise that Jane Elliott did. So what he did was he created a survey for students grades 3 to 6 to discover their attitudes towards certain racial groups. So he compared the students in Riceville, Iowa with a nearby community. And what he found was that Elliott's class were found to be far less racist than the grades above, 4, 5, 6. But he also found that the students in Riceville were far less racist and showed a lot less discrimination towards groups and a more positive attitude than the students who were at the nearby community. So it showed that these students were rubbing off on their peers and actually behaving better because of this attitude that they had formed because of the discrimination exercise that Jane Elliott had used. Just a few more additional research. The Dove Counterbalance Intelligence Test by Adrian Dove that we did at the beginning, Jane Elliott used that intelligence test a number of times throughout some of her exercise, and it would prompt a lot of discussion. So she really liked to use that. And as we kind of said at the beginning, that test was made to ensure that white folk would not know the correct answers about life in the 50s and 60s for African Americans. So it was just a great way to kind of like flop the roles. So same kind of general idea about forming your attitude, but in this way, it was just a test that flopped roles. So the counterbalance intelligence test. And then in chapter 4, we also learned about Zimbardo's prison study. And this just goes hand in hand and correlates pretty well with this. Just how it shows how students who were assigned a prisoner or guard role picked up that role very easily. And although they had no reason at all to show hate towards one another, that they had a negative attitudes towards one another without having any reason at all. So tying this into chapter 4, the ABCs of attitude. So affect, which is the feelings that we have, and then behavior and cognition. So those are the thoughts. So that's where attitude follows behavior. And then attitude is influenced by our beliefs and determines how we will respond either favorably or unfavorably towards others. And then self-perception theory is exactly what Elliott was trying to do. She created, excuse me. So self-perception theory explains attitude formation. So as we act and reflect, we develop our attitudes and that which guide our future behavior. So by doing this exercise, she was able to make her class and or adults, whoever she does this exercise on, she is able to help them reflect on discrimination as a whole, and then hopefully lead to more positive attitudes in the future and have more positive behavior towards minorities or people of color. So then the next part is just implications for society. So implications for society include what the society should do to act against negative attitude formation towards minorities or people of color. So this exercise that she used in 1968 is as relevant then as it is today. So these are just some of the ideas that we have, and the first one is just that fixing our system so that all votes count. Right now we have the Electoral College, and me and Burke talked about how having ballot security systems would maybe benefit our voting system, and just making sure that people of all culture and all demographics have an equal opportunity to vote. And then fixing the system to get rid of abuse of power. That kind of goes back to voting. So just making sure that we all vote and we all put in, put the person in office who we believe is going to do the right thing and the best, and like treat everybody the best and do what is right for the states. And yeah, just having a good community that surrounds whoever is in power, to support them and help give them, help them hear the voice that we have as a community. And then the next is building more schools than prisons. So this just goes with making education more of a priority. By building more schools rather than prisons, we are setting up our youth for success rather than expecting them to fail. The next one is change the history books that we use. In our history books, we often show only one side of history. So by changing out our history books or adding more to history books, it will hopefully show more than just one side. Hopefully there won't just be a mini baby paragraph about these horrific things that have happened to minorities. Hopefully it will be more of a topic where everybody understands, and we're open to that discussion, and we want to talk about it so that we can help make better decisions for the future. The next one is widen the values in our school curriculum. So we just want to make sure that we're educating more than one side for that. You shouldn't just be educating one specific value. We should be educating values as a whole. And then the last one is stop targeting people of color. So that would just be, don't portray people as villains, don't target anyone of color and assume that they're doing wrong when they aren't. And really our whole purpose by implementing these changes in our society will not end people's attitudes. Everyone's always going to have their own attitude, but our job is to educate and try to open the eyes of those who disagree, and just to create a more open discussion about discrimination, and just creating more positive attitudes towards people of color, minorities, as well as the other way around, as people of color or minorities should change their attitude as well towards the white folk.
I agree. And, back to what Madison was saying, that, I think this study is more relevant today than ever, because we haven't had, with what's going on right now in our society with the protests and everything else, it hasn't been this bad since the death of Martin Luther King. So I think, a lot of the issues that we spoke about previously in ways to help reduce discrimination in our country, those are all good. We could always have room to improve. We could always get better. But I think it ultimately comes down to our own attitudes. You know, we might not be able to end discrimination, but we could certainly control how we respond to it. Um, and I think, you know, systematic racism is a big part of that, where, you know, it was in the 60s with these culturally biased tests, and you still see it today with, you know, if people are born of a certain race, of a certain social status, or, you know, if they're wealthy, you know, these people have much better opportunity at succeeding in life and staying out of prison and having that support system that people need in order to be successful in life. Um, so just to summarize what we went over, what started as a classroom exercise in 1968 for a group of third grade students is now one of the most influential exercises on attitudes towards discrimination. What Jane Elliott was able to do in 1968, she was able to change the academic performance of her students within less than a 24-hour period. This is unheard of in the academic world. There was also a lot of outrage as well. You know, she didn't get along with her colleagues. The parents of her students were upset. They didn't feel like this exercise was ethical or, you know, served its purpose. But, you know, we actually watched a documentary on Elliott where she had her same third grade students come back about 10 years later as grown-ups. And they watched their videos and they talked about the exercise on how it had such an impact on their lives and how they wouldn't discriminate, you know, had it not been for that exercise. So Jane Elliott received a large amount of hate for this exercise. Like we said, she faced adversity from colleagues, administration, and parents of the community. Jane Elliott actually went back to her school around 2002 to visit her old classroom where she did this exercise for the first time. And people, you know, she still wasn't welcome in the community. The principal of the school didn't allow her to go back to her classroom. So she did face a lot of adversity. And I think she was a woman who was ahead of her time to be able to come up with a classroom exercise which still, you know, holds relevant almost, yeah, about more than 50 years later. I think that's a pretty, I think that's pretty amazing. Although she received a lot of hate, there were many who supported her idea. This exercise is still as relevant today, if not more, as it was in 1968.
Awesome. And here's our references. And thank you guys for all listening to our presentation. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you guys. Good luck.